Hey everyone, this is Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we are benchmarking Titanfall's performance on multiple video cards. I already published this full article, linked in the description below. Hit that if you want more information, but this is sort of the video component to show you what the game actually looks like on various settings, just for your own curiosity. We previously benchmarked the performance in Titanfall's beta, but that was before official drivers were released for the cards to support different profiles, and it was of course before the game was finalized. So I've revisited it now that the game is final to kind of give you an update on how different cards perform. The cards we're testing today include XFX's Ghost 7850 1GB card, a GTX 650 Ti Boost 2GB card courtesy of Fred, shout out to Fred, an AMD A10 5800K APU which has a 7660D GPU component, a GTX 760 2GB card, and then we've got four more, three of them by MSI. The first is a GTX 750 1GB card, which uses the new Maxwell architecture. It's the 28 nanometer version of Maxwell. There's an MSI R7 260X 2GB card, and an MSI R9 270X 2GB card, which is one of the most expensive ones right now, especially with the cryptocurrency boom. The last card is my old GTX 580, which I suspect there's something weird with the 580 in this test, so if you have your own 580, please tell me what your results are, but we'll get to that in a moment. I tested the game using these settings. It's pretty maxed out. There has been some criticism online of my use of 8x MSAA anti-aliasing, which is totally valid. You probably don't want to use that in a real-world scenario, so I will grant that, and in the future we will do multiple tests with max AA and with a lower AA like 4x or 2x. But this is what I tested with, so that's what we got. Everything's set to high, texture resolution is set to insane, and it is double buffered, so we can actually push 120 FPS to the 120 Hz monitor if the card is capable, because the game will limit your frame rate based on the frequency of the monitor and based on your VSync settings. This will allow you to output a higher frame rate to a high frequency monitor, so that's what we got. Now, the A10 5800K and Intel HD 4000, I didn't mention the HD 4000, both of those were tested with different settings shown here. The HD 4000 I had to further decrease to 900p because 1080 was just too much for it, man. It just couldn't do it. I ran 5 test iterations for each device, and I ran them all largely on the same maps as the other tests. We did not test on Lagoon because there were some frame rate drop issues, so that map was eliminated in order to normalize the results. But other than that, everything was pretty constant. What you're looking at in terms of this chart is the average FPS, that's the blue bar, that's the one you care most about, the minimum FPS, which is the absolute lowest point, and then the 1% time low FPS. So here's why I include that. With minimum FPS, you may very well just be getting an outlier, right? Just like with the maximum FPS. I actually did not include max FPS because it's kind of silly. You'll end up with outliers, or you just end up 120 all the time with some of these cards, because it's really not hard to push 120 FPS at some point in the gaming process when that's your maximum FPS possible with the game and the monitor. The 1% time low is FPS that is output 1% of the time. So that would be a pretty good representation of your lag spikes over the course of a minute. You'll see 1% is low enough where you'll see those spikes, those drops, and it's definitely worth looking at here. What we have in terms of results, we'll start at the very bottom with the HD 4000. Unlike beta, the HD 4000 was actually able to play Titanfall, so that's a pretty big difference, because in beta it was totally unable to play the game. It had serious we'll call them artifacting and mesh tearing issues. If you're a game developer, please feel free to correct me on the use of those terms. The HD 4000 this time at 900p with the low settings that I showed put out 16 FPS at best. at average, I should say. It was 60 max, but again, that was an outlier. With 1080p, it was closer to 10 FPS if we're generous. It was actually like 9.4, I think. So definitely not a viable option just using the HD 4000 alone. You would need to run a 13:7 resolution or something to even get a reasonable FPS. The AMD A10 5800K is Trinity. It's a couple generations old and was actually, I think, maybe the first desktop APU off the top of my head. And so it has the 7660D in it, which is it was pretty damn impressive for its time, and it's still impressive in Titanfall. I was really quite shocked to see that it averaged 33 FPS. That's fairly playable. I know a lot of you, more serious gamers, myself included, I can't play less than 60 FPS. It drives me crazy. But being realistic here, if you have an A10 5800K, you're on a budget already, and 33 is totally playable. It's fine. It's not the most fluid thing in the world. You might see a couple drops, but it does look pretty damn good given that the APU was like, I don't know, 150 bucks or whatever when it was brand new. So then we have the GTX 580. This is the one I said should maybe be discarded just because it's a bit odd. It should not perform this low. It should probably be it should probably be above the 650 Ti boost, almost assuredly. So here's the thing. The 580 that I used to test works perfectly fine in other games that I validated it with. I was concerned about the health of the card after I saw these results, so I did test it with other games, and it performed where it should relative to these other devices. So I don't know what's going on with Titanfall and the 580 that I have. I have an old EVGA 1.5 gigabyte one, but they're not happy playing together, so it just kind of keep that in mind. Your 580 may perform better. If you have one, please test it and let me know below. The GTX 750 is a new Maxwell architecture card. It's on 28 nanometer version of Maxwell, and it performed really, I mean, it really impressed me. I was blown away by its consistency here. So if you have a 750, or if you have like a $130 to $140 budget, this is something worth considering, because a 1 gigabyte 750 with max AA, with max everything, with insane textures, had an average FPS of 49 and a 1% low of 26.8. So if you drop MSAA, if you drop to maybe like 2x or 4x, if you drop texture resolution to very high from insane, you're gonna play this game just fine with the card. I also noted in the benchmark article that this was one of the smoothest devices in terms of the actual frame times, in terms of stuttering. That's probably partly because it's Maxwell and has some improvements on those fronts, but it does perform very well. The 7850 similarly did pretty well. It was 49.8 average, and pretty much same stuff I said previously. Doesn't have any noticeable tearing issues, or at least not frequently. The GTX 650 Ti Boost 2 gigabyte model way outperformed everyone else in terms of consistency. It was the most consistent device on the bench, in that it had a very high minimum and a very high 1% low that weren't too distant from its average of 51 FPS. Very smooth card, and played the game quite reasonably at high settings, or max settings in this case. The R7 260X performed a little bit better than that. No visible issues with tearing that were noteworthy. Same for the 270X, and that is starting to hit the high end, so you can probably start running things like Fraps or screen capture software with this card and with the 760, and you'll still get away with a reasonable frame rate even with that software running. The GTX 760 performed just as well as we would expect. It was 81.75 FPS average. It actually outperformed itself in the beta benchmark, which is a good thing because that shows there were some optimization improvements either on the driver side or on the game side. And it did have some visible stuttering issues. It had stuttering issues even on high resolution textures, or very high, I should say. So it was not an issue with VRAM caching out. It's just some issue with the card, and other people have noticed this online as well. So that's our Titanfall benchmark. Please hit the link in the description below for the full article, and we will see you all next time. Peace.